I had exactly $612,440.83 sitting in a court-restricted escrow account the morning my younger brother told me I could attend our father's memorial gala, but only if I let his future in-laws believe I was outside compliance counsel and not family. The message arrived while I was lying flat on my living room rug in Seattle with a heating pad across my lower spine, still stiff from surgery and angry at myself for dropping a coffee mug 20 minutes earlier because my hands had not fully stopped trembling. He said the night needed to be clean, the donors needed to feel stable leadership, and certain people would ask complicated questions if they realized I was our father's older daughter and one of the co-trustees on the Mercer Maritime Legacy Fund. At the bottom of the message, almost as an afterthought, he added a photo of a brass key I had never seen before. "Bring the lockbox this opens," he wrote. "If you miss this, you lose everything." I put the phone face down. Then I stared at the ceiling and realized, with that cold, slow clarity that arrives before a storm, that this was not about grief. It was about control, money, and the one clause in our father's irrevocable trust my brother was praying I had never read closely enough. Let me take you back. My name is Celia Mercer. I was 38 years old when this happened, and by the time that memorial gala was over, my brother had lost the engagement he thought would elevate him, the title he had rehearsed wearing for years, and the inheritance he had practically built his personality around. None of that happened because I yelled. None of it happened because I humiliated him in some dramatic scene. It happened because I finally stopped cleaning up the story he preferred to tell about himself. My father, Martin Mercer, built tug and barge logistics routes up and down the Pacific coast, then spent the last decade of his life remaking himself into a respectable public philanthropist with museum wings, scholarship dinners, and carefully curated newspaper profiles. In Seattle, that kind of transformation is treated like moral growth even when it is mostly branding. He was not a cruel man in the obvious ways. He was worse than that. He was persuasive, charming, selectively generous. The sort of father who could fund your brother's startup, buy your mother a waterfront condominium after the divorce, and still leave a lunch with you feeling as if you had somehow asked for too much by expecting honesty. My brother, Graham, was 32 then, handsome in the polished, expensive way men become when they learn early that good tailoring can do half the work of character. He never had to say he was favored. My father made sure the whole family breathed around that fact. Graham got the introductions, the internships, the lunches with shipping executives, the golf lessons, the bridge financing when his first app failed, and then the seed capital when his second one failed more quietly. I got explanations. I got, "You're the steady one." I got, "You understand how the real world works." I got, "You don't need all the attention he does." There are families that choose a golden child through celebration. Mine chose one through infrastructure. By 14, Graham had a summer media coach because Dad said executive presence mattered. At 14, I had a weekend job checking invoices at one of his terminals because, according to him, I was good with tedious things. By 22, Graham had a studio apartment in South Lake Union underwritten as launch support. At 22, I was working nights at a forensic accounting firm, finishing my master's and eating peanut butter crackers for dinner because I was too proud to ask anyone for rent money they would later use as leverage. I became a CPA first, then a certified fraud examiner, and eventually the person companies called when they had already been lied to and wanted someone calm enough to trace the lie all the way back to its source. I liked documents more than people. Documents do not widen their eyes and ask why you are being difficult. Documents do not tell you they love you while quietly moving money out from under your feet. People do that. Families do that beautifully. My flaw, the one I had spent years dressing up as professionalism, was delay. I could identify misconduct faster than almost anyone in a room, but when the source was personal, I always waited one conversation too long. One more chance. One more explanation. One more benefit of the doubt given to people who had spent decades earning none of it. 3 years before the gala, my father had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He moved through treatment the way he moved through everything else, strategically, performatively hopeful, determined to stay in control of every room he entered. During those months, he sold a minority share of Mercer Maritime for an amount that became whispered about in local business circles, then directed a large portion of the proceeds into what his attorneys called an irrevocable trust with charitable subfunds. He liked the sound of permanence. He liked the press release language even more. I remember one of the planning meetings because I was only there by accident. Dad had asked me to review expense controls for the Mercer Maritime Legacy Fund after a donor advisor flagged weak internal segregation. That was the phrase the estate lawyer used, segregation. He meant there should be more than one signature, more than one set of eyes, more than one person capable of moving money without oversight. I agreed. Dad sighed like I was reading out weather warnings at a picnic. The attorney, Neil Brogan, was a white-haired man with a voice so soft everyone leaned in when he spoke. He explained that the trust would be irrevocable, meaning Dad could not simply tear it up on a whim later. Certain distributions would fund annual maritime scholarships, a seafarers' widows' assistance program, and upkeep for a small memorial grant dedicated to my mother, who had died 7 years earlier. Dad liked public memory when he could structure it. Then Brogan added something that did not seem to interest anyone else at the table. There was a fraud carve-out clause. If any beneficiary, co-trustee, or controlling officer induced distributions through concealment, forged authority, falsified certifications, or self-dealing, that person's beneficial interest could be suspended, clawed back, or permanently extinguished upon judicial review. Dad glanced at me then and smiled as if he were indulging one of my little hobbies. Happy now, he said. I said, it's not for me. It protects the trust. He laughed. You say that like there's a difference. At the time, Graham was barely listening. He was texting under the table and asking whether the scholarship dinners could be moved to more visible venues. That was always the difference between us. I listened when lawyers explained how something worked. He listened for when his name would be attached to it. My father died in February, 9 months before the gala. He died on a Thursday morning while rain tapped the windows of his hospital room and a nurse adjusted a blanket he no longer seemed aware of. I was there because I had been there most mornings by then. Graham came later, beautifully disheveled, red-eyed in a way that would have looked suspicious on anyone less practiced. Grief did not improve us. It clarified us. The first ugly incident happened the day after the private burial, when we met in Dad's office to inventory personal papers before the estate attorneys boxed everything for probate review. Probate sounds dramatic when people say it on television. In reality, much of it is slow, administrative, and humiliating. Lists, appraisals, attestations, certified copies, a parade of signatures that turn a person's life into managed categories. Graham showed up 2 hours late, wearing one of Dad's watches and talking loudly on speakerphone about donor tables for a memorial event no one had even formally approved. When I asked him to stop moving files from Dad's desk because I needed the original order preserved, he rolled his eyes and said, Celia, for once in your life, can you not act like a compliance audit grew legs and join the family? My Aunt Denise was there. She laughed. That was how it worked. He would reduce me to a function. Someone else would reward him for it. Then later, if I objected, I would be accused of lacking grace in a hard season. The second incident came 3 weeks later during a planning lunch for the Memorial Gala. We were seated at the Rainier Club with a florist, an event consultant, and 2 foundation staff members Dad had borrowed from another nonprofit board. The event consultant asked about family remarks and whether both children would be speaking. Graham did not miss a beat. My sister handles the back-end trust mechanics, he said with a smile. I'll do the public part. The consultant nodded and turned to me sympathetically, the way people do when they have already been told which sibling is easier. I said, I can speak if a co-trustee statement is appropriate. Graham took a sip of sparkling water and replied, You're great on paper, Celia. It's just not really your room. Not your room. He said it lightly. That was his talent. He could commit a cruelty so polished it arrived wearing manners. After lunch, one of the junior staff members caught up with me outside and said, For what it's worth, I thought that was rude. I thanked her and got in my car and cried so quietly I could still hear the turn signal ticking in the garage. Then came my surgery. I had ruptured a disc months earlier hauling archive boxes up the stairs of my condo like an idiot because asking for help has never been my first instinct. The surgery was minor by surgical standards and major by the standards of anyone who has tried to sleep while their spine feels like a badly aligned zipper. I was recovering, working from home in intervals, still under restrictions, when Graham's message about the gala arrived with the brass key photo and that line at the end. If you miss this, you lose everything. That sentence was not theatrical. It was targeted. He knew exactly which nerve to press. The lockbox in question belonged to my mother. I knew that instantly, though I had not opened it since the month she died. My mother, Helen Mercer, had not been naive. Tired sometimes, yes. Too forgiving with my father, absolutely. But not naive. Before her illness worsened, she rented a small bank box under her maiden name and told me, on one of those foggy afternoons when illness made honesty easier, if your father ever starts treating memory like inventory, there are things in there I don't want revised. At 29, I had thought she was talking about letters. Maybe jewelry. Something emotional. After she died, I took possession of the lockbox but never found the nerve to open it. Grief has strange architecture. Sometimes the heaviest thing in a room is a sealed envelope you are not ready to read. I stared at Graham's text for a full minute before I called Neil Brogan. He answered on the third ring in that soft, careful voice of his. When I told him what Graham had written, he went quiet. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "has your brother ever mentioned the lockbox before?" "No, and has anyone requested trust records from you in the last 10 days? Informally or otherwise?" I sat up too quickly and my back flashed hot with pain. "What kind of records?" "The quarterly disbursement certifications." There was a discrepancy flagged by the independent bookkeeper assigned to the legacy fund. Nothing catastrophic on its face, but enough for me to ask questions. That was the moment the room changed shape. What discrepancy? A reimbursement packet submitted under executive memorial expenses. The packet contains your electronic acknowledgement. I said nothing. Brogan continued, "The acknowledgement appears irregular. I never approved memorial reimbursements. I suspected as much." My voice came out flatter than I felt. "How much?" He told me there had been 4 staged reimbursement requests over 7 weeks. Venue deposits, donor hospitality, transport retainer, legacy curation expenses, polished names, bad intent. Total exposure so far, $612,440.83. The exact amount currently frozen in the escrow sub-account pending verification. Which meant my hook, the amount sitting in escrow that morning, was not just money. It was evidence paused in place. Who submitted them? I asked. The certifications came through Graham's office. But I don't want to make allegations before we complete a forensic review. There it was. Forensic review. My language. My world. Brogan told me the trust permitted emergency administrative restraint if fraud was reasonably suspected. He had already initiated a temporary internal hold and scheduled a probate hearing for the following Tuesday to preserve assets if necessary. If I failed to appear as co-trustee or failed to contest the certifications, the court could interpret silence as acquiescence, releasing the escrow and weakening any later clawback. That was the meaning of Graham's message. He was trying to force me into appearing at the gala with the lockbox, pull whatever he believed was in it, and distract me long enough to miss the filing window. If you miss this, you lose everything. Not everything, just the thing he wanted most. I asked Brogan one question that seemed obvious to me and not to anyone else. What made the acknowledgements look irregular? The metadata. Of course. For most people, metadata is invisible. For people like me, it is fingerprints in daylight, file creation times, device signatures, revision history, location pings, embedded user credentials. The little ghosts attached to digital documents that liars forget exist because they are too busy rehearsing what the visible page will say. Brogan explained that the certification PDFs bore my name, but the embedded creation trail showed exports from a MacBook registered to Mercer Maritime Events, a shell LLC Graham had quietly revived after one of his failed ventures. Worse, two of the digital signatures reflected timestamps during a period when I was in Swedish Medical Center for pre-op imaging. The third was created from an IP block tied to the office suite Graham leased downtown. The fourth had been altered after export, which is the kind of mistake people make when they are confident everyone around them is too polite, too tired, or too intimidated to look closely. That was uniqueness seed number 1, though I did not think of it in those terms then. It was simply truth wearing a technical coat. "I need the full packet," I said. Brogan sent it within 6 minutes. I read every page with the slow, dangerous calm that arrives when emotion is still present but no longer useful. There were forged approvals, padded invoices, duplicate vendor numbers, and one affidavit draft prepared for a foundation coordinator to sign if questions arose. Affidavit is just a formal written statement sworn as true. In decent hands, it stabilizes facts. In bad hands, it launders fiction. Whoever assembled the packet assumed no one would explain the terms inside it to the kind of audience Graham preferred. That was always his strategy. Use sophisticated language around simple dishonesty. Count on the room to confuse polish with legitimacy. I called one more person before I moved. Her name was Vivian Hale, and officially she was listed in the Gala program as Chair Emerita of the Northwest Harbor Children's Fund, one of the lead donors Dad had courted for years. Unofficially, she had once shared a hospice volunteer rotation with my mother and had kept track of me in quiet ways ever since. Christmas notes. A recommendation when I applied for a fellowship. A fruit basket after my surgery, so tasteful I almost resented it. Most people who met Vivian saw an elegant widow with excellent posture and old Seattle money. What they missed, until it was too late, was that she listened with prosecutorial patience. When I told her Graham had asked me to hide my identity at the memorial gala, she did not gasp. She asked who else would be there. I read the list. At one point she interrupted and said, "You mean the full board will be in attendance?" "Yes." "And 2 Maritime Scholarship trustees?" "Yes." "And the museum's audit committee vice chair?" I closed my eyes. Apparently. Then she said, very quietly, "Your brother is either desperate or stupid." That was uniqueness, seed number 2. Social power was already in the room. Graham just didn't understand whose rooms he was actually in. I told her about the forged certifications. She listened, asked whether counsel had preserved the packets, then asked the only question that mattered. "Do you still have your mother's lockbox?" "I do." "Open it before the gala." "Not after." I did not want to, which usually means it is exactly the right thing to do. 2 hours later, wearing a back brace under a coat I hated and moving more slowly than my pride enjoyed, I met Brogan at the private bank where the lockbox was held. He did not hover. He just stood nearby while the manager verified identity and stepped away. Inside the box there was less jewelry than I expected and more paper. My mother had always preferred substance to display. There were 3 sealed envelopes, a blue velvet pouch, and a narrow accordion file labeled in her handwriting, for trust matters only if character becomes a problem. Character becomes a problem. I laughed once, very softly, then felt sick. The first envelope contained letters to me and Graham. I did not open them there. The second contained photographs. The third held a notarized memorandum signed 6 months before my mother died. Notarized simply means a licensed witness confirmed the signer's identity and intent. It does not make a lie true, but it makes later denial more expensive. The memorandum stated that certain waterfront parcels my father often described publicly as legacy family holdings had, in fact, originated from my mother's side of the family and had been placed into a separate marital property agreement with restrictions on transfer. Attached to it was a private instruction letter to Neil Brogan, never delivered, explaining that if any descendant attempted to monetize her memorial fund or misrepresent ownership of her family parcels for personal prestige, her portion of the trust should be directed away from that beneficiary, without sentiment. My mother had underlined those last 2 words. Behind the memorandum was a second document I did not expect, a canary clause. That was uniqueness, seed number 3, and it was exquisite. In plain language, a canary clause is a buried provision designed to expose whether someone accessed altered, or misused a document by requiring reference to a detail only an authorized reader would know. This one was attached to a draft codicil my mother had asked Brogan to consider during her final illness, but never formally incorporated into a will amendment because her condition deteriorated too quickly. However, its language had later been partially mirrored inside the final trust through the fraud carve-out. The clause referenced one specific phrase, Blue Harbor Ledger, which would appear nowhere in general summaries. Any beneficiary citing it without legitimate access would reveal they had opened restricted records or acted on concealed knowledge. I stared at the page for a long time. Brogan looked over only when I inhaled sharply. "What is it?" he asked. My mother built a tripwire. He read the clause and closed the file with far more force than he usually showed. "Well," he said, "that may become useful." Useful is one of those beautiful professional words that can contain vengeance without ever saying it aloud. The velvet pouch held a brass key matching the photo Graham had texted me. Also inside, a tiny engraved tag with a number that matched an old document cabinet in Dad's office. So Graham had not even been sure what the key opened. He just knew there was a box and suspected it mattered, which meant he was moving fast, probably because the escrow hold had spooked him. That evening, I read my mother's letter to me. It was mercifully brief. She wrote that love without respect curdles into service, and service without boundaries turns daughters into storage. She wrote that I had a dangerous habit of mistaking endurance for virtue. Then she wrote, in handwriting that tilted more as the page went on, if your father or brother ever force you to choose between peace and accuracy, choose accuracy. Peace built on your silence will never belong to you. I slept 4 hours that night and woke with pain running down my hip and a clarity I had not felt in years. Saturday morning, Brogan and I went to Dad's office with a locksmith, 2 witnesses from the firm, and a portable scanner. The brass key opened a narrow flat file cabinet hidden behind framed regatta photographs Graham had always described as the historical wall, as if history itself were an accessory he had curated. Inside were parcel maps, old ownership schedules, draft donor decks, and a black notebook in my father's hand containing talking points for the gala. One page had Graham's handwriting across the margin. Need to keep Celia off stage. Donors respond better if structure looks unified. Structure looks unified. Below that, in different ink, another line. If she asks about Mom's side parcels, say Brogan already consolidated title. He had not. Parcel title transfers do not happen because someone says they did over scallops at a private club. They require recorded deeds, tax treatment, signatures, sometimes probate clearance, sometimes court approval, always paper. There was no recorded consolidation, which meant Graham had either lied about ownership to donors or intended to. Either way, he had walked directly into the fraud carve-out. By Sunday, Brogan had secured an emergency petition draft. Petition is just a formal written request to a court asking it to do something specific. In our case, preserve the escrow, suspend Graham's discretionary control, authorize an expedited forensic audit, and enjoin, meaning legally prohibit, further representations about trust assets until review. He asked whether I wanted to file immediately or wait until after the gala. After, I said. He looked surprised. Why? Because he's counting on me to panic privately. I'd rather let him perform publicly one last time. Brogan considered that and nodded once. All right, but then we do this cleanly. Cleanly. That mattered to me. Monday was the gala. It was held at the Pacific Maritime Museum overlooking Elliott Bay, the kind of venue where grief can be rented in elegant lighting. My father's memorial had become, under Graham's direction, less a remembrance than a controlled succession event. Donor walls. Preview film, embossed place cards, a scholarship announcement, a display case of family artifacts arranged to imply continuity, virtue, and public usefulness. Seattle loves a legacy as long as the wine is good and no one cries in the wrong place. By noon, I had received 3 separate messages from Graham asking whether I had the key and whether I understood how important the evening was. In the last one, he wrote, "Please don't make this difficult." That line made me smile. I wore charcoal silk instead of black, because black would have looked like mourning, and I was done performing the version of grief my family found tasteful. I still moved carefully because my back had not magically forgiven me, and halfway through fastening one earring, I dropped it on the bathroom tile and cursed loud enough to embarrass myself. Human imperfection. There it was. Then I bent too fast to retrieve it, saw stars for 3 seconds, and laughed because apparently the body enjoys reminding the ego of its actual jurisdiction. Vivian Hale arrived at my condo at 6:15 instead of sending a driver, which told me more about the night than anything else could have. She took one look at me and said, "Good. You look like a woman no one should underestimate in low light." That was her version of comfort. On the ride over, she told me something she had deliberately withheld on the phone. "I accepted a formal role in tonight's scholarship pledge process," she said. "The board asked me to verify initial donor instruments before publication." I turned to look at her. "Why didn't you mention that earlier?" "Because I wanted to know whether your brother would lie on his own or only when nudged." "And?" Her mouth curved faintly. "I think we're about to find out." The museum was lit in amber and navy when we arrived, all polished glass and low music, and that particular species of expensive sorrow that smells faintly of orchids. At the entrance, a huge display board bore my father's photograph beside the words Martin Mercer Legacy Evening. Underneath, in smaller type, stewardship, scholarship, harbor. Stewardship is a lovely word when used honestly. In the Mercer family, it mostly meant whoever held the microphone longest. Graham met us in the lobby. For one strange second, when he saw Vivian on my arm, he actually looked relieved. He mistook her presence for validation. That was his problem. He never understood that important people have the same range of moral possibility as anyone else. He assumed wealth and polish automatically preferred him. He kissed the air near my cheek and murmured, "Thank you for not making this weird." I said, "You should save that sentence. You may need it later." His smile flickered. Then he noticed I had not brought a lockbox. "Where is it?" he asked under his breath. "Safe." "Celia, don't use that tone with me." He drew back at once because people were watching. The room was already full. Scholarship trustees, shipping executives, museum patrons, journalists from 2 local business outlets, my father's former counsel, a retired state appellate judge, Vivian's donor circle, Graham's fiancée, Lila Ashford, near the central display in a pale blue gown, receiving condolences with the poised warmth of someone raised to make social labor look effortless. Her father, Russell Ashford, stood nearby speaking with the museum's board president. He was not a federal judge. He was more dangerous for Graham's purposes. Russell Ashford chaired the audit committee for one of the region's largest philanthropic networks and sat on 3 private endowment boards. A man like that does not merely donate. He decides who appears safe to other donors. Graham had not hidden me because he feared legal comparison. He had hidden me because he feared governance. That difference mattered. He guided me toward the rear edge of the room, where a small table had indeed been set near the service corridor under the pretense of easier seating while you recover. I almost admired the consistency. Humiliation dressed as accommodation is one of the family trade languages. I took the seat. Vivian did not. Instead, she touched my shoulder once and drifted toward the front with the ease of a woman who needed no permission to alter a room. I sat with a glass of still water and watched the architecture of my brother's confidence. He moved from donor to donor, telling versions of the same story. Dad had trusted him with vision, expansion, the future. He referenced the family parcels twice. I saw his hand rest lightly on the display case that held vintage harbor charts and a silver compass he claimed had belonged to our grandfather. It had not. It was bought at auction 6 years earlier. My family loved authentic-looking objects more than actual truth. Lila crossed the room at one point and introduced herself with perfect courtesy. Up close, she seemed more thoughtful than the role Graham had assigned her in his mythology. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Are you?" That made her blink. Then, to her credit, she smiled slightly and said, "I suppose that depends on whether anyone's been honest with me." I liked her a little for that, which made the rest sadder than it needed to be. When she asked what I did, I did not rescue anyone. I trace financial misconduct for a living, I said. The expression on her face did not change dramatically, but some inner accounting began. You could almost hear it. At 7:30, the program began. There was a string quartet, a museum director speech, a short memorial film with harbor footage, and exactly the kind of narration my father would have loved, because it made discipline sound indistinguishable from goodness. Then Graham stepped to the podium in a midnight tuxedo and told a room full of influential people that our father believed legacy was not what you left behind, but who you empowered to carry it forward. I wondered whether he could hear himself. He spoke well. That was the aggravating part. He had timing, charm, and a polished way of seeming heartfelt while staying vague enough to avoid the truth. He thanked donors, praised Lila's family, invoked stewardship again, and announced that the Mercer Maritime Legacy Fund would soon expand its scholarship platform through Consolidated Family Harbor Holdings and Aligned Philanthropic Reserves. There it was. Consolidated Family Harbor Holdings. A lie cleanly delivered. From the corner of the room, I saw Vivian lift her eyes to Russell Ashford. He looked interested now. Graham continued, "My father believed families are strongest when they present one vision." That sentence might have passed as sentiment to anyone else. To me it sounded like evidence volunteering. Then he said the phrase. Some of these plans were outlined years ago in the Blue Harbor Ledger my father kept for core heirs. The Blue Harbor Ledger. The canary clause sang. I did not move. I did not gasp. I just felt something inside the evening lock into place with a precision so satisfying it almost hurt. Only someone who had improperly accessed restricted records, or had been told of them by someone who had, would know that phrase. It appeared nowhere in Gala documents, no donor summaries, no trust abstracts. My mother had buried it like a mine under polished ground. Russell Ashford's head turned slightly. Neil Brogan, stationed by the side aisle, lowered his program and looked straight at me. He had heard it too. Graham had no idea he had just triggered his own collapse in a room full of witnesses. When he finished the speech, applause rose dutifully. Then came the pledge announcement portion, which Vivian had agreed to facilitate. She took the stage with serene authority and thanked the museum, the donors, and the Mercer family for gathering in a spirit of transparency and service. Transparency. Another beautiful word. She began with donor commitments, then invited Graham back for a ceremonial signing of the scholarship instrument. This was not legally required. It was social theater. Graham adored social theater because he assumed he could always direct it. A silver folder was placed on the lectern. Cameras lifted. Guests leaned in. Vivian said, "Before signatures are witnessed, our standard process requires verification of represented assets, governing instruments, and authorized officers. Mr. Mercer, thank you again for your patience." His smile tightened. "Of course." She opened the silver folder, but instead of reading the pledge summary, she removed a second packet, cream paper, tabbed, formal, and handed it to Russell Ashford. I saw the moment Graham's spine changed. Vivian continued, her tone mild enough to count as devastating. Because the expansion references consolidated harbor holdings, restricted trust assets, and charitable subfund reserves, it seemed prudent to confirm authority with counsel present. Now the room was listening in a different way. Not casually. Professionally. Graham laughed once. "I'm sure that can be handled after the ceremony." Neil Brogan stepped forward. "No," he said. "It should be handled now." You could feel the social temperature drop. Brogan introduced himself as counsel to the Mercer Maritime Legacy Fund and me as co-trustee, which caused more than one head to turn toward the back where I was seated. He did not dramatize. He explained. That is often much worse. He said a co-trustee is not decorative. A co-trustee has fiduciary duties, meaning legal obligations to act in the best interests of the trust and its intended beneficiaries, not in the interests of whichever family member happens to be charming under a blighting. He explained that any material representation about trust-held or trust-adjacent assets required proper authorization, and that certain reimbursement certifications had been suspended after irregularities were identified. Graham tried to cut in. This is not the time. Brogan replied, "It became the time when you referenced restricted records on a public stage." Vivian then asked a question so simple it felt surgical. "Mr. Mercer, how did you become aware of the phrase Blue Harbor Ledger?" He stared at her. Lila stared at him. Russell Ashford's expression had gone entirely still. Graham recovered fast enough to be dangerous, if the room had been less intelligent. He said Dad had discussed it with him privately. A plausible answer. Smooth. Almost good. Brogan said, "That is unlikely." The phrase appears only in a restricted memorandum associated with a conditional canary clause preserved outside the public trust summary. Murmurs now. Small, controlled, expensive murmurs. He explained the clause without jargon. A canary clause is a buried identifier that reveals unauthorized access if repeated by the wrong person. My mother had designed it as a safeguard in case anyone later tried to manipulate family property narratives for personal advantage. Someone near the donor tables whispered, "Good Lord." Graham looked toward me then, not because he wanted my help exactly, but because for the first time all night he understood I was not a spectator. I was the person in the room who knew where the paper lived. He tried indignation next. "This is absurd." My father discussed family strategy with me constantly. Brogan nodded. "Then you won't mind explaining the metadata on 4 reimbursement certifications bearing Ms. Mercer's forged approval." He handed the packet to Russell Ashford and the museum's audit committee vice chair. Not theatrically. Efficiently. The vice chair put on reading glasses. Russell took his time. Brogan explained metadata to the room the way I might explain it to a client who had just realized their CFO was not as clever as he thought. Files carry invisible information, when they were created, where they were altered, what device exported them, which user credentials touched them. In this case, certifications purporting to originate from me were created on a device registered to Mercer Maritime Events LLC and altered during hours when hospital records placed me off-site under medical care. Graham said, "That proves nothing. Staff could have assembled drafts." I stood then because the next part belonged to me. The room widened. Or maybe my breathing did. I did not hurry. I walked to the front with care, one measured step at a time, because pain has a way of forcing dignity if you let it. When I reached the lectern, I looked not at my brother first, but at the people whose silence mattered. "My name is Celia Mercer," I said. "I am Martin Mercer's daughter. I am also co-trustee of the Mercer Maritime Legacy Fund and the person whose approvals appear on those certifications. They're false." There was a sound in the room I cannot really describe. Not shock exactly. Recognition, perhaps. The sound adults make when a social evening becomes a legal one. I explained the 4 disbursement requests. I explained that escrow means funds are held in a neutral or controlled state pending certain conditions. The $612,440.83 in question had not cleared into general use because counsel preserved it after irregularities emerged. I explained that a forensic audit is not some dramatic accusation. It is a systematic review of records, authorizations, vendor histories, and flow of funds to determine what happened and whether representations match reality. Then I looked at Graham. "You texted me this morning," I said. "You told me to bring my mother's lockbox and said, if you miss this, you lose everything." "Why?" He actually had the nerve to smile. "Celia, I was trying to protect Dad's event from exactly this kind of scene. That line might have worked on a weaker room." I took out my phone and handed it to Vivian, who read the message aloud in full, including the part where he instructed me to let his future in-laws believe I was outside counsel and not his sister. No one moved. Lila closed her eyes once. That hurt to watch. My mother always said truth is most effective when read in a level voice. Vivian proved her right. Then Russell Ashford asked the question that ended the performance. "Did you intend tonight's donor commitments to rely on assets you do not control?" Graham opened his mouth and, for the first time in his life, the room did not help him. He tried blame first. He said Dad had promised him operating leadership. He said the trust structure was always fluid. He said I was overreacting because I resented being less public-facing. It would have been almost laughable if it had not been so familiar. That was when Lila spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly. You told me your sister handled clerical compliance, she said. You told me she preferred not to be visible. You told me you were consolidating holdings with counsel's approval. Each sentence stripped a layer off him. He said, Lila, not here. She answered, you seem comfortable using here when the line helps you. I felt something in my chest unclench at that. Brogan then produced the final blow from the packet, a draft affidavit prepared for a foundation coordinator to sign if questions arose, falsely attesting that I had verbally reviewed and approved memorial reimbursements. The coordinator was not in the room, thank God for her, but her supervisor was. He went pale halfway through page 2. Russell Ashford handed the papers back to Brogan with terrifying care. I think donor discussions are over, he said. That sentence traveled through the room like weather. Then Vivian, who had not raised her voice once all evening, said, no pledges will be accepted tonight under contested authority. Graham turned to me in open desperation then. Celia, please, he said softly, as if softening the volume could restore the hierarchy. Can we talk privately for a minute? I looked at him and saw him clearly. Not monster. Not villain from a screenplay. Just a man who had been rewarded for vanity so consistently that he mistook it for confidence. No, I said. You were comfortable making me smaller in public. You can hear the answer in public too. That landed harder than anything else I said all night. Lila took off her ring then. It was not theatrical. No tears. No shaking. Just a woman removing herself from a version of the future that had suddenly become too expensive to buy with dignity. She set the ring on the signing folder and stepped away from him. I heard someone near the sidebar whisper, oh. Russell Ashford crossed to his daughter, put a hand lightly at her back, and turned to Graham with the kind of restraint that should terrify any liar. You will not contact my family tonight, he said. You will direct all future communication through counsel if necessary. Counsel if necessary. It was such a civilized sentence. It destroyed him. The evening could have ended there. Socially, it had. But official endings matter more to me than symbolic ones ever will. Brogan asked me quietly whether I wanted to proceed with service. I said yes. 2 process servers had been waiting outside with courtesy copies of the emergency petition and notice of Tuesday's probate hearing. Service is just the formal delivery of legal papers, so no one can later claim they were not informed. Graham received the packet in the museum lobby under the glass model of a 19th century clipper ship, while donors pretended not to watch. He did not touch it for several seconds. Then he said my name the way he used to when we were children, and he wanted me to fix something he had broken before Dad noticed. I kept walking. Tuesday morning, the probate courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and radiator heat. Courtrooms are less glamorous than angry people imagine. Fluorescent hallways. Bad coffee. Files stacked in rolling bins. But they possess one quality social rooms do not. Relevance. In a courtroom, charm has to share space with documentation. Graham arrived with separate counsel and the exhausted look of a man who had finally realized a tuxedo is not a defense. My mother sat behind him in camel wool and quiet outrage. Antony's came too, because of course she did. She liked front row seats to consequences as long as she could later claim she hated scenes. The judge assigned to the emergency matter was Elaine Duval, a patient woman with the kind of expression that suggested she had heard every possible version of "this is all a misunderstanding" and found none of them original. Brogan moved for continuation of the escrow hold, suspension of Graham's discretionary authority, appointment of a neutral forensic auditor, and provisional enforcement of the trust's fraud carve-out pending findings. He did not overstate. He did not embellish. He walked the judge through the certifications, the metadata trails, the unauthorized public representations, the CANARY clause trigger, and the documentary chain from my mother's memorandum to the restricted parcel schedules. Graham's lawyer argued family confusion, grieving miscommunication, ambiguous delegation, incomplete records. All the usual phrases people use when they hope vagueness might soften math. Then the coordinator whose affidavit draft had been prepared appeared by subpoena and testified that Graham's office had asked her to sign a clarifying statement she was uncomfortable with because she had never heard me approve anything by phone. She did not sign. That helped. Then the IT consultant retained by Brogan explained the device logs in plain English. He identified the user profile used to export the certification drafts, the Office IP block, and the post-export edits. He explained that one signature image had been lifted from an unrelated board resolution PDF and overlaid onto the reimbursement sheet. He used the phrase digital artifact matching. Graham looked physically ill. When I testified, I kept it simple. I identified my role, my recovery timeline, my lack of approval, the lockbox, the CANARY clause, and the specific text message. I did not speculate about motive beyond what the documents showed. Documents do their best work when people stop decorating them. Then came the moment. Judge Duvall reviewed the exhibits in silence for almost 30 seconds, long enough for the room to feel itself waiting. Then she looked up and said, "The court finds credible evidence of unauthorized certifications, attempted self-dealing, and materially misleading representations concerning restricted trust-associated assets." The courtroom went silent. There it was. Not because the line was dramatic. Because in a real courtroom, silence means the air has understood before the people have. Judge Duvall granted the continued asset freeze on the $612,440.83 escrow amount, suspended Graham from any managerial or representative role involving the trust or Gala-related donor outreach, authorized a full forensic audit, and set an evidentiary hearing on permanent remedies under the fraud carve-out. She also instructed that no beneficiary or representative make further public claims about consolidated parcel control without documentary proof. Then she added, almost as if she were disappointed in the species, "This court does not view family status as a substitute for authorization." I wrote that line down later because it deserved to survive. Outside the courtroom, my mother finally confronted me, not with remorse, with indignation. She caught my arm lightly in the corridor and said, "You could have handled this without destroying your brother." I looked at her hand until she let go. "No," I said. "He could have handled this without trying to steal from a memorial fund and hide me in the process." Her face hardened. "That is such an ugly way to describe your own family." I said, "Accuracy often sounds ugly to people who benefited from the lie." She flinched as if I had raised my voice. I had not. Graham did not speak to me that day. He signed something with his lawyer, avoided cameras, and left through the lower parking entrance like a man abruptly introduced to the concept of ordinary exits. The audit took 6 weeks. Forensic work is not glamorous. It is repetition, cross-reference, reconciliation, and patience. Vendor matching, ledger review, email recovery, LLC registration searches, bank trace requests, board minute comparisons. We found more than the initial reimbursement packet, not millions. This was not that kind of story. Bad enough. Consulting invoices routed through Mercer Maritime Events LLC. Premium travel charged to donor cultivation. A retainer paid to a branding firm tasked with building succession materials positioning Graham as sole legacy steward. Draft decks referencing parcel values he did not own. It was not cinematic. It was worse. It was ordinary greed wrapped in presentation software. The fraud carve-out hearing occurred in January. By then the findings were clean enough that even Graham's lawyer had stopped pretending this was emotional overreach. The court permanently extinguished his beneficial interest in the portion of the trust tied to my mother's memorial fund and family parcel-linked distributions. The improperly requested funds remained frozen until recovery allocations were complete. The court also approved governance revisions removing unilateral public representation authority from any family member and installing an outside administrator for donor communications during the audit period. In simple terms, Graham lost access, status, and the ability to call himself the future of anything that mattered. Lila never went back to him. I know this because she sent me a note 3 months later. Not a dramatic letter. Just 1 page. She wrote that seeing how easily a man diminished his own sister had forced her to reconsider every charming explanation she had accepted in order to preserve comfort. She thanked me for not lying to make the evening easier. I kept that note, not as a trophy, but as evidence that not everyone in a broken room chooses denial. My mother wrote twice. Both emails were masterpieces of selective sorrow. They mentioned stress, public embarrassment, family strain, and the unfairness of legal escalation. They did not mention forged approvals or the memorial fund by name. I answered neither. My Aunt Denise texted once to say, "I hope you're happy." I blocked her number while waiting for a latte and felt lighter before they called my name. As for Graham, Consequence did what years of guidance could not. His consulting title at one of Dad's affiliated ventures vanished first. Then 2 donor boards quietly removed him from exploratory committees. He had not committed a criminal act that drew headlines, but in philanthropy and legacy governance, being seen as sloppy with fiduciary boundaries is its own form of exile. People may forgive vanity. They do not forgive risk attached to their names. He sold the leased Aston Martin I had privately hated. He moved out of the View apartment. He stopped appearing in local business features. One mutual acquaintance told me she ran into him at a coffee shop in Bellevue wearing a cheap overcoat and the expression of a man who had just discovered that networking is much harder when no one believes your introductions anymore. I did not ask for details. Karma rarely improves under inspection. What changed most was not his life. It was mine. For the first month after the hearings, I still reached for my phone sometimes when something good or irritating happened, from habit, as if family were a place information went before it settled. Then I would remember and put the phone down and feel the ache of that empty reflex. Boundaries do not immediately feel noble. At first, they feel like phantom pain, a missing limb of routine. But then something quieter began. I slept better. I stopped drafting imaginary explanations in the shower. I stopped rehearsing gentler versions of the truth in case other people found the honest one inconvenient. I went back to work fully. I reviewed internal controls for a hospital network. I testified in a procurement fraud matter. I rebuilt my core strength with a physical therapist who looked like she could deadlift a canoe and took no interest in my excuses. I hosted exactly 6 people for dinner one rainy Saturday and realized halfway through dessert that none of them required me to become smaller in order to stay comfortable. I cannot explain to you how radical that felt. Vivian Hale remained in my life in the precise, unsentimental way she always had. Once, over tea, she said, "Your mistake was never that you were too serious. It was that you kept applying serious ethics to unserious people and calling them mismatch patients." I wrote that down too. Neil Brogan retired that spring and sent me a fountain pen with a card that said only, "Use this on things worth preserving." I laughed for a full minute after I opened it. 1 year later, I stood on a small stage at the Pacific Maritime Museum in the same harbor-facing wing where my father's memorial gala had collapsed, and I announced the first clean scholarship cycle of the restructured Mercer Maritime Legacy Fund. No family branding. No succession theater. No invented parcel stories. Just documented grants, outside oversight, audited controls, and 3 scholarship recipients who cared more about marine engineering and harbor logistics than legacy politics. It was the most beautiful event our family name had ever been attached to precisely because our family had so little to do with it. Vivian was there. Neil came out of retirement for one evening and sat in the second row with the smugness of a man who enjoys being proved right. Russell Ashford attended too, which surprised me until he quietly told me his network had decided to support the widow's assistance sub-fund because, in his words, governance should reward the right person eventually. Lila was not there. That felt appropriate. Her life had moved on. So had mine. After the announcement, I stepped outside onto the museum terrace with a cup of bad event coffee and looked over Elliott Bay under a sky the color of brushed steel. The wind lifted my hair. Somewhere inside, people were laughing in that low, easy way they do when no one in the room is pretending. I thought about the back table near the service corridor where Graham had planned to place me the year before. I thought about the brass key, the lockbox, my mother's handwriting, the CANARY clause. The text message he thought would pressure me into obedience. I thought about how long I had mistaken accommodation for peace. Then I understood something I wish I had learned 10 years earlier. Boundaries are not punishments. They're infrastructure. They're how self-respect is made livable. Without them, every manipulative person in your life will eventually try to turn your steadiness into unpaid labor. My brother lost money, status, an engagement, and an inheritance stream. Those were consequences. Real ones. But the thing he really lost was access to the version of me that would absorb humiliation quietly so he could keep calling himself good. That version is gone. Not because I became hard. Because I became accurate. If you are listening to this and you have spent years being described as the difficult one simply because you remember what actually happened, I want you to hold on to this. The people who love you with integrity will never require your diminishment as the price of belonging. Anyone who asks you to disappear so they can look cleaner in public is not protecting the family. They are protecting the lie. And sometimes the most complete revenge is not spectacle. It is documentation. It is timing. It is letting truth arrive with witnesses and then refusing to interrupt while it does its work. So tell me, have you ever been treated like the inconvenient truth in your own family story? And when did you finally realize peace built on silence was costing you too much? If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.